This story was sent in by a woman named Rachel. She's 33. She lives in Portland now, but she grew up in northern Minnesota, and this story is about the summer she was 24 when she and 3 friends rented a cabin on a lake about 2 hours north of Minneapolis for 2 weeks. She says it was supposed to be the kind of summer you look back on as one of the best. She says instead it is the summer she thinks about every time she hears water at night. Here is her story. The 4 of us had been talking about doing a lake trip together since sophomore year of college. Me, my best friend Dana, Dana's boyfriend at the time whose name was Chris, and my other close friend Jess, who I had known since middle school, and who was the one who actually found the cabin listing and sent it to the group chat at 11 on a Tuesday night with a message that just said, "We are doing this." We were doing this. The cabin was on a lake called Mirror Lake about 2 hours north of Minneapolis, in the kind of Minnesota lake country that people who have never been to Minnesota don't fully understand. I am not talking about a pond. I am talking about the kind of lake that has its own weather, its own moods, its own particular quality of light at different times of day that makes you understand why people build their whole summers around being near one. Clear water and pine trees, and a quiet that is not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of a place that is full of its own sounds, and has no room for the sounds of the world you came from. I had grown up going to lakes. My family had rented cabins every summer when I was a child, and I had that particular relationship with lake country that Minnesotans develop early. A comfort with it, a sense of belonging, a feeling that this specific landscape is coded into you at a level below conscious thought. The cabin was exactly what the listing had described. A 3-bedroom wood frame structure about 40 feet from the water, with a screened porch that faced the lake and a dock that extended out far enough to dive from, and a small aluminum rowboat tied to a cleat at the end of it. The interior was the particular aesthetic of a lake cabin that has been furnished over decades. Mismatched, but comfortable. Everything slightly worn in ways that felt friendly rather than neglected. A stone fireplace. A kitchen with everything you needed and nothing you didn't. Bookshelves filled with paperbacks left by previous guests, the spines soft with humidity. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. We unloaded the cars and claimed our rooms, and by 6 in the evening we were on the screened porch with cold drinks, watching the light change over the water, and I remember thinking with complete sincerity that everything was exactly right. That feeling lasted 9 days. The first 8 days were everything we had wanted them to be. We swam in the mornings when the water was cold and the lake was still and the mist was still lifting off the surface. We took the rowboat out and fished badly and talked for hours. We drove into the nearest town, a place called Garrison that had a gas station, a bar, a bait shop, and not much else. For supplies every couple of days, we ate late dinners on the porch and played cards, and sat around the fire pit after dark and talked the way you talk when you are 24 and you have nowhere to be, and the night is warm, and the people around you are the ones you would choose above anyone. Dana and Chris had a fight on day 5 that lasted about half a day and then resolved itself the way fights between people who love each other resolve themselves. Jess got a sunburn on day 3 that she complained about credibly for the remaining 11 days. I read 2.5 books and finished a letter to my grandmother that I had been meaning to write for 3 months. Ordinary and good. The kind of days that you know while they are happening are going to become the texture of a memory you return to. On the 9th day I woke up early, earlier than usual, the particular wakefulness of a body that has reset its clock to the lake's schedule, rising with the light because the light was worth rising for. It was just past 6. The cabin was quiet. I went to the kitchen and started the coffee, and while it brewed, I went out onto the screened porch to watch the lake. The rowboat was gone. I stood on the porch and I looked at the dock and the empty cleat where the boat had been tied, and I felt the particular disorientation of seeing something absent that you expect to be present. I went down to the dock. The rope was still there, still tied to the cleat, still knotted the way Chris had tied it the first day. But the boat was gone. The rope had been untied from the boat's end and left, neatly, not cut, not broken, untied and left coiled on the dock. I looked out at the lake. The lake was still and clear in the early morning light, the mist low on the water the way it always was at this hour, and about 200 yards out I could see the rowboat, just sitting there, motionless on the flat water, empty as far as I could tell from the dock. I went back inside and I woke Chris because Chris was the one among us who had grown up around boats and who would know if there was some ordinary explanation I was missing. He came out in his t-shirt and shorts, squinting at the morning, and looked at the dock and looked at the boat out on the water. He said he had tied it up himself the night before. He said the knot he used didn't come undone. He said boats don't untie themselves and row themselves 200 yards out onto a lake. We stood on the dock looking at the boat for a moment. Then Chris got his swimming trunks on and swam out and towed it back. The water was cold this early and he was not happy about it, but he brought the boat back and tied it up again, and we went inside and had coffee, and by the time Dana and Jess were up, we had decided not to say anything about it. We didn't want to change the feeling of the trip. We should have said something. That night I woke up at 2 a.m. I was in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, the one that faced the tree line rather than the lake. My window was open because the night was warm and I slept better with the air moving and the sound of the lake in the distance. Something had woken me. Not a sound exactly. More the absence of a sound I had been hearing in my sleep. The particular rhythm of the lake sounds that had become the background of my nights at the cabin and that had, in the moment of waking, briefly stopped. I lay still and I listened. The lake sounds resumed. Water against the dock pilings, the slight lap of a small night wind, the frogs that sang from the reeds on the far side of the cove. And something else, underneath those sounds, or between them. A sound that did not belong to the lake or the night or the cabin. A sound like movement on the dock, footsteps on wood. I lay in my bed in the dark of that back bedroom, and I listened to footsteps on the dock outside the cabin, and I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, a deer that had come down to the water's edge and was moving along the dock planks the way deer sometimes do. I told myself this, and I almost believed it, until the footsteps stopped and something knocked on the hull of the rowboat. One knock, clear and deliberate. The particular hollow sound of a knuckle on aluminum. Not an animal sound, not a water sound, a human sound, the sound of a person announcing themselves. I did not get up. I want to be honest about that. I was 24 years old, and I was alone in the back bedroom of a cabin on a lake in the middle of the night, and I heard something knock on the boat, and I did not get up. I lay in that bed, and I pulled the sheet up, and I listened until the silence had been complete for long enough that I could start to breathe normally, and then I lay there until morning. In the morning, I told the others. Dana wanted to leave immediately. Chris thought there was an explanation and spent 20 minutes offering them. A branch falling on the boat, sound traveling across the water from another property, someone on the lake who had come too close to the dock in their own boat in the dark. Jess was quiet. She had the look she got when she was thinking something she wasn't sure she wanted to say. I asked her what she was thinking. She said she had woken up 2 nights before around the same time. She said she had heard something outside and had told herself it was an animal and had gone back to sleep and had not mentioned it because she didn't want to make anyone anxious. She said she had heard footsteps on the dock. We all looked at each other across the breakfast table in that cabin kitchen in the morning sunlight, and the lake was beautiful outside the window, and none of us wanted to be the one to say what we were all thinking. Chris drove into Garrison that afternoon and spoke to the man who ran the bait shop, who was the kind of person who knew everything that happened around the lake and was willing to tell it. He came back an hour later and was quieter than he had been when he left. He said the man at the bait shop had told him that Mirror Lake had a history of what he called trespassers. Not in a criminal sense, more in the sense of people who moved through the lake properties at night without being invited. He said it had been going on for years. Cabins whose boats moved in the night. Docks where people heard footsteps. Screen doors found open in the morning that had been latched the night before. He said nobody knew who it was. He said the people around the lake had stopped reporting it because nothing ever came of the reports. He said the man at the bait shop had told him one more thing. He said they had always been harmless. He said that like it was reassuring. We stayed the remaining 5 days. I am not sure that was the right decision, but we had come a long way and spent real money on the rental, and there was something in all of us that resisted the idea of being driven away from something we had wanted so much by something we couldn't even see clearly. We stayed. We kept the porch screen latched. We pulled the rowboat up onto the shore at night rather than leaving it on the dock. We left a light on inside. Nothing happened on the 10th night or the 11th. On the 12th night, our second to last, I woke up again at the same hour. I lay in the dark and I listened, and I heard footsteps on the shore, not the dock this time. The shore, moving slowly along the water line in front of the cabin, from one end of the property to the other, and then back again. Steady and unhurried, the particular sound of someone walking a route they knew well. I went to the window. I looked out at the lake and the shore and the dock in the pale light of a 3/4 moon. I could see the shore clearly enough. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued. For another minute, 2 minutes, the sound of someone walking the shoreline in front of the cabin while the shoreline stood empty in the moonlight. And then they stopped, and the lake was still. And in the morning we packed our things and we drove south, and I have not been back to Mirror Lake since. I think about the man at the bait shop sometimes. The way Chris said he had told him they had always been harmless, the matter-of-factness of it, the way it was delivered as reassurance. What I keep coming back to is the word always. Not they are harmless. Always. As if harmless was the best available word, not safe, not nothing to worry about, just always harmless. So far. This one comes from a man named Joel. He's 29. He grew up outside of Nashville, and this story is about the summer he was 22, working his first real job out of college, living alone for the first time in an apartment in a city he had moved to, knowing almost nobody. He says the 4th of July that summer was the loneliest he has ever felt, and that loneliness turned out to be the least of his problems. Here is his story. I moved to Cincinnati in May right after graduation. I had taken a job at an accounting firm. Entry level, the kind of position where you spend your first year learning how much you don't know. And I had found an apartment online before I even visited the city. A 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building in the Clifton neighborhood, close to the university. The kind of neighborhood with good coffee shops and a used bookstore and enough foot traffic that you didn't feel isolated even when you were. I knew nobody in Cincinnati. That is the honest truth of it. I had grown up in a small town outside Nashville where everyone I knew had known everyone I knew since elementary school, and moving to a city where I had 0 existing relationships was something I had wanted badly, and found, in practice, to be harder than I had anticipated. I was fine. I made that distinction to myself regularly in those first months, not struggling. Not unhappy, just in the particular in-between state of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is building from scratch and is okay with the pace of that most of the time. The 4th of July that year fell on a Thursday. The firm gave us Friday off, making it a 4-day weekend. Most of my coworkers were going home to families, to lake houses, to the established social structures of people who had somewhere to be on a holiday. I had been invited to a cookout by a woman from my office named Claire, who I had eaten lunch with a few times, and who was genuinely kind, and I had told her I might come, but had known by the time I said it that I probably wouldn't. I spent the 4th alone in my apartment. I ordered food and I watched a movie, and at 9 in the evening I went up to the roof of the building, because the building had a roof access and I had been told by another tenant that you could see the fireworks from the city display from up there. You could. I stood on the roof of my building in Cincinnati and I watched the fireworks go up over the city, and I called my mom and she asked how I was and I said fine, and she knew from the particular fine that I used that I meant mostly fine, and she talked to me for 20 minutes about home and my dad and the dog, and I felt better and worse at the same time, the way you do when you are homesick and someone from home calls. I went back downstairs at around 10:30. My apartment door was unlocked. I had locked it. I am certain of this the way you are certain of the things you do every single time without variation. I locked the door when I left because I always locked the door when I left. The lock was a deadbolt. It required a key from the outside. The door was unlocked. I stood in the hallway outside my apartment with my key in my hand, and I looked at the door and I felt the particular stillness that the body produces when it is deciding something important. I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark. I had left one lamp on in the living room, the one on the end table near the couch, and it was still on, casting the same warm light it always did. From the doorway, everything looked exactly as I had left it. I reached in and turned on the hallway light, stood in the doorway and looked at the apartment. Nothing moved. Nothing was obviously wrong. I went inside. I checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the closet. Under the bed, I'm not too proud to tell you that I checked under the bed. Everything empty, everything in its place. I went back to the living room, and I stood in the middle of it, and I looked around carefully the way you look at a room you know well when you are trying to determine if something in it has changed. Something had changed. On my kitchen counter next to the coffee maker there was a glass of water, full. Not my glass. It was my glass from my cabinet, but I had not poured it. I had not been in the kitchen before going to the roof. I was certain of this because I had gone straight from the couch to the roof when I decided to go up, and I had not stopped in the kitchen. A full glass of water on my kitchen counter that I had not poured. I looked at it for a long time. Then I called my building manager. His name was Frank, and he was a good building manager, responsive and practical and not given to alarm. I told him my door had been unlocked when I came back from the roof, and that something in my apartment seemed different. I asked if anyone had been in my apartment. He said no. He said he had not authorized any entry and that maintenance had not been in. I asked if anyone else had a key to my unit. He said only him, and the master key was secured. I thanked him and hung up. I slept with the chain on the door that night. I told myself it was the 4th of July, a holiday. People in the building had been drinking, celebrating, coming and going. Maybe I had been distracted when I left and had not locked the door as securely as I thought. Maybe the glass of water had been there before I left and I had simply not registered it. I held these explanations for about 4 days, and then things started happening that were harder to explain. Small things, the kind that are individually dismissible and collectively impossible to ignore. My things were being moved, not dramatically, not thrown around or displaced in obvious ways, moved in the small, precise way of someone who was being careful. A book on my nightstand that I had been reading, facing a different direction in the morning. My coffee mug, which I always left handle facing right on the drying rack, consistently facing left when I came down in the morning. A chair at my kitchen table pulled out an inch or two more than I had left it. Small things. I began to document them. I took photos of my apartment before I left every morning, and when I got home every evening I went through the apartment and compared what I saw to the photos. This probably sounds extreme. It felt extreme to do it. But there is a particular state of mind that small, unexplained things produce over time, a low-level alertness that builds until you need the evidence of documentation just to know whether you can trust your own perception. The photos confirmed it. Things were being moved while I was at work, not every day, not in any pattern I could identify. But the photos didn't lie, and the documentation didn't lie. And by the end of July, I had a folder on my phone with 37 sets of before and after photos, and in 11 of them, something in the apartment was different in the after image. 11 days out of 30. In my locked apartment, I found out how in August. I had bought a small motion-activated camera, the kind people use as nanny cams, barely larger than a smoke detector, and positioned it in my living room facing the front door. I told nobody because I was aware of how this looked and I needed to know before I said anything to anyone. I went to work on a Tuesday. I came home at 6. I pulled up the camera footage. At 11:17 in the morning, a man let himself into my apartment with a key. He was in his 30s, average height, wearing jeans and a dark t-shirt. He moved through the apartment with a familiarity that made my stomach drop, not looking around, not exploring, just moving through the space the way you move through a space you know. He went to the kitchen. He was off camera for about 4 minutes. He came back through the living room. He looked at the bookshelf. He straightened one of the books. I found it later, the only one in the row that was perfectly aligned. He stood in the middle of my living room for a moment, looking at the apartment around him. Then he let himself out. He had been in my apartment for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. I took the footage to Frank. Frank watched it twice. He said he did not recognize the man. He said the key the man used was clearly a door key. You could see the shape of it in his hand, and that the only way to get a key to my unit would be from him or from a previous tenant. He said the previous tenant had been asked to return their key when they moved out. He went to his records. The previous tenant of my apartment was a man who had moved out 8 months before I moved in. There had been a gap of 8 months between that tenancy and mine, during which the apartment had sat empty. Frank said the previous tenant had returned the key, but the look on his face when he said it told me he was not completely certain. The police took a report. They reviewed the footage. They identified the man as a former resident of the building, not the direct previous tenant of my unit, but someone who had lived in the building 3 years earlier and who had apparently retained or copied a key to my specific apartment at some point during that tenancy. He was found. There were no signs of theft or physical disturbance in my apartment that constituted a criminal act under the relevant statutes, which the officer explained to me in a way that I understood, but that felt deeply inadequate. He was given a formal warning. I moved out at the end of my lease. I moved to a building with a key fob system and a camera on every floor, and I have never since lived somewhere without first asking exactly how many copies of the key exist and who has them. But I think about those 11 days, the 37 sets of photos, the glass of water on the 4th of July that I had not poured. I think about him standing in the middle of my living room looking at the apartment around him, not taking anything, not disturbing anything, just being there, just standing in my space and looking at the life I had arranged in it, and then leaving it exactly as he found it, as if he just needed to be somewhere familiar for a while, as if my apartment was somewhere he still felt at home. This last one was sent in by a woman named Diane. She's 47. She lives in Savannah, Georgia, now has lived there for 20 years. And this story is about the summer she was 19 and working as a counselor at a summer camp in the mountains of North Carolina. She says she has told parts of this story to a few people over the years, but has never told all of it. She says she is telling all of it now because her own daughter is 19 this summer and is talking about taking a counseling job at a summer camp, and Diane wants her to read this before she decides. Here is her story. I took the counseling job because I needed the money, and because my friend Amy was doing it, and because the alternative was spending the summer in my parents' house in Charlotte, which at 19 felt like a kind of slow suffocation. The camp was called Camp Ashwood. It was in the mountains about 2 hours west of Charlotte, the kind of North Carolina mountain country that is beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people write songs about it. Green and deep and folded in on itself, the mountains layered behind each other all the way to the horizon. The air at that elevation cleaner and cooler than anything down in the Piedmont. I had been a camper there myself, at 12 and 13, and the place had a particular hold on me because of it. The specific nostalgia of returning somewhere as an adult that you had loved as a child. The way it is the same and different at the same time. The way your body remembers a place even when your mind has let the details blur. Amy and I arrived on a Sunday in early June for counselor orientation week. There were 14 counselors in total, ranging from 18 to 25, mostly college students home for the summer or just graduated and not yet fully committed to whatever came next. We were assigned to specific cabins. I had a cabin of 12-year-old girls, which felt appropriate given that I had been a 12-year-old girl at this camp 7 years earlier. And we spent the week learning protocols and procedures and the particular culture of Camp Ashwood, which had been running since 1954 and had the kind of established traditions and internal mythology that old summer camps develop when they have been in the same place long enough. One of those traditions was a story. Every camp has them. The particular ghost story or local legend that gets passed down from counselor to counselor and camper to camper over the years, growing and changing in the telling, until it is less a story than a piece of the place's atmosphere. Camp Ashwood's story was about a counselor named Daniel. Daniel, according to the story as it was told to me by one of the returning counselors during orientation week, had worked at Camp Ashwood in the summer of 1978. He was 19, the same age I was when I heard the story. He had been assigned to one of the boys' cabins. By all accounts, he had been good at the job, liked by the campers, by the other staff. In August of 1978, on the second to last week of camp, Daniel had gone into the woods alone one evening after dinner. He had not come back. A search had found nothing. Not him, not any sign of where he had gone or why. The woods around Camp Ashwood were extensive. The camp sat inside a much larger tract of mountain forest, and a search over several days had turned up nothing. He had simply gone into the woods and disappeared. The story, as camp mythology had developed it over the subsequent decades, was that Daniel never fully left, that he was still there in the woods around the camp, that sometimes at night you could hear him moving through the trees beyond the cabin clearing, that occasionally a counselor or a camper would see something at the edge of the tree line after dark, a figure standing and watching, before it withdrew into the dark between the trees. I heard this story on the third night of orientation week, sitting around a fire with the other counselors, and I did the thing you do when you are 19 and someone tells you a ghost story. I leaned into it, and I felt the pleasant theatrical shiver of a well-told tale, and I went to bed and slept without any trouble. The camp started the following Sunday, and on the second night of the first session, I heard something in the woods behind my cabin. My cabin, Cabin 7, sat at the edge of the main clearing, closest to the tree line of any of the girls' cabins. There was maybe 30 feet between the back wall of the cabin and the first trees of the forest. I was a light sleeper then, as I am now, and the mountain nights at Camp Ashwood were a different kind of quiet than I was used to. The deep layered quiet of a forest at elevation that was full of its own sounds, and in which a human sound registered immediately as different. What I heard was footsteps, not close, not right outside the cabin, further back, in the trees or at the edge of the trees, the particular sound of movement through underbrush, deliberate and unhurried. I lay in my bunk. The counselor's bunk was at the front of the cabin, separated from the girls' bunks by a thin partition, and I listened. I listened for several minutes, and the sound continued at irregular intervals, movement in the trees, stopping, starting, moving parallel to the cabin, and then stopping again. I told myself it was a deer. The mountains around the camp had deer and black bear, and any number of things that moved through the forest at night. I told myself this, and it was a reasonable thing to tell myself. But deer move differently. Deer move through underbrush with a particular sound of their own, a crashing, A crackling, the movement of an animal that does not think about where it puts its weight. What I was hearing was more careful than that, more considered. I heard it on the second night and the third and the fourth. On the fifth night it was closer, not in the trees, at the edge of the trees, right at the boundary between the forest and the 30 feet of open ground between the tree line and the back of cabin 7. I got up. I went to the small window at the back of the counselor partition, and I looked out. The moon was up, and the clearing was pale in its light, and the tree line was a dark mass at the edge of the pale ground, and I looked at it for a long time. I saw something, not clearly, not in a way I can describe with precision even now, 28 years later. A darkness within the darkness of the trees that had a different quality from the surrounding dark. The particular density of something that is present rather than absent. Something at the tree line that was not moving but that gave the impression of having recently moved, of having stopped. I looked at it for what felt like a very long time, and then it withdrew. Not suddenly, gradually, the particular way that darkness shifts when something moves back into it, and the density resolves back into the ordinary dark of the trees. I stood at that window for a long time after. Then I went back to my bunk, and I lay on my back, and I looked at the ceiling of cabin 7, and I thought about a 19-year-old boy who had gone into these woods in August of 1978 and had not come back. And I thought about how in the morning I would be looking after 12-year-old girls in a cabin 30 feet from those trees. I told Amy the next day. We were on a break between activities, sitting on the steps of the dining hall in the noon sun, and I told her everything. The footsteps, the nights, what I had seen at the tree line. I told her without performing it, without the theatrical frame of a ghost story, just as a series of things that had happened and that I needed to say out loud to someone. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said she needed to show me something. She took me to her cabin, cabin 4 on the far side of the clearing from mine, not close to the tree line. She took me to her bunk and she pulled a notebook out from under her mattress and she handed it to me. It was a standard composition notebook, the black and white kind. Old. The cover was soft with age, the corners worn. She said she had found it in the storage space under the counselor's bunk when she arrived. She said she had assumed it was left by a previous counselor and had almost thrown it away but had opened it first. I opened it. The notebook was a journal. Daily entries, dated. The handwriting was small and neat, the pen pressed firmly enough that you could feel the impressions of it on the back of each page. The first entry was dated June 1978. I sat on Amy's bunk and I read that notebook. I will not tell you everything that was in it because some of it was personal in ways that belonged to whoever had written it, and I did not feel then and do not feel now that it was mine to share, but I will tell you the shape of it. The writer was a counselor, a young man the same age I was, working his first summer at Camp Ashwood. The early entries were exactly what you would expect, the adjustments of someone new to a job, observations about the other counselors and the campers, the particular comedy and difficulty of being responsible for a group of children in a confined space for an extended period. His name was not in the notebook, not his full name, just an initial, the way some people journal, a privacy habit even in a private document, which I found both touching and sad. The initial was D. The entries continued through June and into July. They were good entries, observant, funny in places, honest in the way that private journals are honest. He wrote about being homesick in the first week and then not being homesick at all by the third week because the camp had become its own complete world. He wrote about a girl at a neighboring camp that he had met on a joint activity day and who he had been thinking about. He wrote about the mountains and the way they looked in the early morning when the mist was in the valleys. In late July, the entries changed. Not dramatically, just the same shift in texture I had noticed in the notebook in the hotel room. Something becoming more interior, more preoccupied. He wrote about feeling watched, not by the other counselors or the camp staff, by something outside. something at the edge of the camp's clearing at night. He wrote about hearing things in the woods after dark that he couldn't account for. He wrote about going to the tree line one evening after dinner to look at something he had seen from the cabin window. The entry after that one was short. It said, "I went too far in. I lost the path. It took me 2 hours to find my way back, and I don't fully remember those 2 hours, and I am not going to write about this anymore." There were 3 more entries after that, brief and factual, as if he had decided to stop putting things into the journal that he didn't want to look at later. The last entry was dated August 14th, 1978. It said, "Going out after dinner. I know I said I wouldn't. But there is something I need to understand, and I think the only way to understand it is to go back." That was the last entry. Amy and I sat in cabin 4 in the noon sunlight with that notebook between us for a long time. We went to the camp director that afternoon. Her name was Margaret, a woman in her 60s who had been running Camp Ashwood for 20 years and who had the particular authority of someone who has been in a place long enough to become part of it. We showed her the notebook. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at us. She said she knew about Daniel. She said his disappearance was part of the camp's history and had never been resolved. She said the notebook, if it was genuine, was something that should be turned over to the relevant authorities and she would take care of that. I asked her about the things I had heard and seen, the footsteps, the tree line. She looked at me with an expression that I have thought about many times since. Not dismissive, not alarmed, something between the two that I can only describe as knowing. The expression of someone who has been asked a question before and has decided how much of the answer to give. She said the woods around Camp Ashwood were old, and that old forests had sounds and shadows that were easy to misinterpret. She said the camp had been operating safely for decades, and that the welfare of the campers and staff was her absolute priority. She said I should make sure my cabin windows were latched at night. She said it like a practical suggestion. She said it like she had said it before. I finished the summer. I did not leave early. I want to be clear about that. I stayed because the girls in my cabin were 12 years old and they needed a counselor, and I was not going to abandon them because of something I could not prove and could not fully explain. But I latched the windows every night, and I did not go near the tree line after dark. And on the last night of camp, when the counselors sat around the fire and the summer was over and the mountains were dark and close around the clearing, I looked at the tree line for a long time, and I thought about a 19-year-old boy who had written in his journal that there was something he needed to understand. And I hoped, sitting there in the firelight with the dark forest at my back, that he had found it. Whatever it was, I hoped it had been worth going back for. All right, guys, those are the 3 stories for tonight. Thank you to Rachel, Joel, and Diane for sending those in. Diane, that last one, the notebook. I think about that a lot. Thank you for finally telling all of it. If you have a story you want to share, the email is in the description. It does not matter how long ago it happened. It does not matter if you think people will believe you. Send it in. If you are new here, subscribe. New videos every week. Stay safe this summer, and good night.